Great. We have a lot to cover today. So I'll go ahead and dive in. Good morning. Happy Friday. My name is Michelle Conley. I'm the Senior Director of Partnerships here at World Trade Center, Utah. I want to wish everyone a happy belated Liberation Day. Of course, yesterday was the 1 year anniversary of Liberation Day, which is what started all of this and was the impetus for this webinar series to begin a few weeks later. So pretty wild to realize it's been a year since a lot of these changes with tariffs were put into place, and appreciate you all hanging in there with us as we've worked together to navigate all of this. For today's webinar, you'll hear, of course, from Ben Kolendar, our Chief of Staff and expert on the team on tariffs, with quite a few updates with what's going on, as well as our guest today, who is recently retired Brigadier General Eric Strong. He retired here to Utah, and he joined World Trade Center Utah late last year, as our national security advisor. He is a resource that we utilize ourselves, but that we also have available to companies. To help them navigate not only challenges related to national security and global defense, but he's also an expert at organizational transformation, leadership development, strategic problem solving, topics like that. And so he's just a great person to know and connect with. We've asked him to join today's webinar to speak specifically on the conflict in the Middle East, and the impact it's having on trade, supply chains, and business broadly here in Utah. We've heard from many companies, of course, who are concerned with what's happening in the Middle East, the impact it's having on their business, and how to navigate that. So really looking forward to hearing from General Eric Strong and his insights. But first, of course, we'll have a tariff update from Ben. Did want to make a quick shout out. Ben was approached by the Global World Trade Center Association. If you don't know, there are over 300 World Trade Centers around the world, to present on World Trade Center Utah's tariff dashboard, because it's kind of the only thing of its kind out there. And so really proud of him. And I'll actually go to Philadelphia to present on that in a couple weeks. So great shout out to Ben, but we'll let him dive in with updates.
Well, thanks, Michelle, and shout out to Lena as well, who's making all these last minute, like rapid fire updates to our dashboard as these updates become available. So I'm going to share my screen really quick as I normally do here. All right. So go through every week. This is our dashboard. It's you can find it at wtcutah.com/tariffs. We've got a link for these webinars. So if you want to share it with anybody in your network who would benefit from these briefings, please feel free to do so. And also one thing we don't cover much in this is where to start. This is especially important when um, we're shifting in terms of an overall strategy for how these tariffs are implemented and what they mean. And, when we go from IEEPA to this new set of 232, 301 tariffs coming in place on top of the 122s that are in place until July. This is a good checklist to start that we don't reference enough in these, but just to clean up, go through, make sure that you're following certain things that can help your business and help you go on offense. So, Michelle also touched on Liberation Day. I'll touch on it as well and just say thanks for joining us. It's been a volatile year, and since April 2nd of 2025, we've had I don't know how many tariff actions take place, and we've done our best to stay on top of all of them and just keep our business community updated through this platform. So we just appreciate your engagement and attendance, and hopefully this is useful to you and your company as well. With that, I'm going to dive in. We've got two very complex tariffs, and I say complex, and we're going to cover them in a little bit of detail, but we'll probably have to even come back on another webinar to go even deeper because this is multifaceted on both of these tariff actions. So the first is on pharmaceuticals. Both of these on steel, aluminum, copper, and pharmaceuticals are complex for a few reasons. One, for pharmaceuticals, they apply to companies, they apply to regions, they apply to products, they apply to countries, all in different ways. And so it's not just global tariff on everything for all these countries. It's nuanced and there's so many annexes and facets to this, but essentially what the administration's looking at is there is a 20% tariff that is set to go into effect in July from um, a proclamation released yesterday on these 232s for pharmaceuticals. These tariffs are primarily targeted towards companies, but also have a layer of country. So if you're, in the UK as a company, you're going to have a different tariff rate than, a company in any other country because the UK has a favorable deal that's carved out in this, right? So these tariffs are tiered by companies, so there's a set, and you can see them on the annex that we can go into here. Well, that's the fact sheet. Apologies, the executive order. On these executive orders, you can go down to the very bottom and you'll see the annexes associated with the executive order. There are different tiers of companies. So you have a tier of companies in Annex 1 or Annex 2 and Annex 3. So it gets a little complex, but essentially, in the 20% tariff on Annex 3 goes into place in July, and then all other companies go into effect in September, and that's the baseline 20%. Then this goes up to 100% in April of 2030. So there are two things at play here. One is encouraging companies to give, as a part of a White House program, and most favored nation and MFN status in terms of reducing costs for pharmaceuticals into the US. That can bring down the tariff rate or reshoring certain operations. There are exclusions in here for various supply chain needs in the US that are critical. There are exclusions for companies. But all to say, this is a basic on pharmaceuticals and the resources. If you need to dive in more on your specific product, you could do so on our website. The next one up is the steel and aluminum tariff. So um, this is also a complex one. So if many people recall, there are 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum as well as copper. This took all of these orders and put them into one proclamation to adjust these. These tariffs, the biggest thing on these tariffs that I can see that are going to impact many Utah companies is that it shifted a lot of the tariffs on the content of the steel, aluminum, and copper into products and shifted that into a tariff on the final product. And so that's going to affect many folks because as the tariffs have been done on the 232 so far for many of our importers, it's been you could do the calculations on your content for your steel, aluminum, copper, and this changes that, and that will affect many folks. It also has a lower rate for the UK, so it's you've got this situation where it's like, what are you doing with it? How are you processing it? There are reductions for all three of these if you're processing it or using steel, aluminum, copper from the US in your product. So it's also multifaceted. And this is one of those things that we could dive down, spend a full webinar on each one of these to break it down. But we're just touching on the high levels in this one, and we'll search for some great lawyers or folks involved in this to really give the breakdown on each of these in greater detail. But for now, um, just know it's complex. You can go through and see on our website how each of these applies to your business operation. I always start for the now, therefore, because this stuff is just a justification at the top and it gives you the date. So it's effective April 6th, 12:01 Eastern Time, and it gives you the different clauses and situations. The annexes as well are found at the bottom, so you can click that and see specific HTS codes and if your product applies or not. But without going into too much details on these, because I could do this for another 20 or 30 minutes and not let Eric give his presentation, which I don't want to do. I'm going to just cut those two off there and we'll dive into those in a future webinar. Um, the last thing I do want to mention is the 122 tariffs that are in effect. Um, Actually, two things. One is the 122 tariffs. There are oral arguments scheduled for April 10th, which is a week from today. There are two primary cases in front of the Court of International Trade. One of those cases was brought by 24 states. Another case was brought by Burlap and Barrel. Both of those cases are combined in front of the same panel for the oral argument on April 10th at 10 a.m. Eastern. So that's right before we are doing this webinar. So I don't know that we'll have updates next Friday, but the following Friday we'll certainly have some updates on what those court cases on the 122 tariffs look like. Now, finally, the last update is the we've gone through this before, and the date is quickly approaching for the four-step process. So that's not the primary source document. Here it is. So the primary source document for what we can expect for that 45-day window, which is expected to end on April 20th for these 120 or these IEPA refunds. Sorry. Um, Customs is going through the final details of what that looks like. But one update is that we're seeing many companies look at potential loans against an asset, which is the refund, the promised refund. So not to say we don't have a resource on here saying, hey, here's how that works, but rather flagging for you and your financial institution to perhaps consider that if it's a fit for your business model, as many banks and businesses are starting to approach, oh, well, now that there's some clarity around the refunds, what it means, if we need to finance for against those refunds while we wait for them. Some institutions and folks are doing that. They still have interest rates and other things. So, as it fits your model, but definitely worth mentioning and flagging as companies in Utah are thinking about going on offense and what that means for your business operation. So that is a lot. I was so brief on what could have been way more in depth on these two tariffs for pharma and some of the metals on the 232s, but we'll get some more organized content around that for next week. Potentially, I'll look at Michelle and see if we can do that. We'll figure that out sometime in the near future. But for now, I'm gonna stop and hand it back so that we can talk about some things going on in the Middle East.
Thanks so much, Ben. Yeah, so much to talk about this week. And yeah, like you said, we'll get some great folks on in these coming weeks to dive deeper. Yeah, really excited to have General Eric Strong dive in from here. What is going on in the Middle East, Eric?
Hey, good morning, everyone. As Michelle said, my name's Eric. Retired from the Army about 6 months ago and moved out to Utah with my wife and kids. 5 weeks ago, the United States, in conjunction with Israel, launched Operation Epic Fury, a different name for Israel. Ostensibly, kind of five broad goals have been continually laid out by the president and the senior military leadership. Destroy Iran's ability to project their navy, ensure that the world's number one sponsor of terrorism cannot export terrorism or ever have a nuclear weapon, and destroy Iran's missile, specifically ballistic missile capability, and their ability to rebuild that capacity. And we're seeing that now over the last couple of weeks with attacks on infrastructure. In addition to the human toll and the damage to infrastructure across now 14 nations and counting in the Gulf, the hostilities have had a huge disruption to the supply chain across the globe on everything from helium to fertilizer to oil-based products. These disruptions are going to continue till the Strait of Hormuz is open and energy facilities that have been attacked have an ability to reconstitute. Qatar has said it could take 3 to 5 years to fix some of the damage to their production facilities, especially for liquid natural gas. And some of the bigger issues when we look long term is the actual potential disruption to the entire world order that one could argue that for the last 80 years has enabled global trade, and the implications for some of that, and interesting thoughts and questions on what is the impact to China, what is the impact to China versus Taiwan, and things like that as we go forward. The United States and Israel have had tremendous success on their military objectives. The president spoke Wednesday again about the success of the military objectives. But military objectives, traditionally, they need to last to the strategic political objectives that are laid out and to kind of win the peace. We've seen this. There's actually a book by, I think his name is Gordon Gideon, in the 2010 that talked about how wars end and how often military objectives are met, but do they actually continue on to reach political ends that leaders across the world wanted at that time? The best example is World War II, but even with World War II, it took the huge infusion of the Marshall Plan to truly kind of win the peace in an articulate term. How has Iran responded to all this? Their leadership has been killed in targeted strikes. They have responded by attacking about 13 countries. They've been very clear on this throughout their history that any country that hosted an American military base or they thought complicit with actions by Israel or the U.S. against Iran, that they would retaliate against those countries. We're seeing that with thousands of attacks across multiple countries. This is a very deliberate targeting process by Iran to cause maximum economic pain for really the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, as well as U.S. allies and partners across the world. We saw Hezbollah respond to U.S. and Iranian attacks by attacking Israel. Israel has then used this opportunity to also attack into southern Lebanon, further causing, I think the latest number was about 1 million internal displacements among Lebanese citizens. Where this kind of ends right now, the president again on Wednesday talked about he saw 2 to 3 more weeks. Diplomatic efforts have public information on it is very sparse. There's been talk of a 15-point plan, which Iran has basically said was a non-starter. And Iran has kind of doubled down saying they need to control the Strait of Hormuz as part of their future security. So what does this mean in kind of just broad numbers and terms? Just a few stats for you. Within Utah, the price of a gallon of gas has increased $1.41 since February 27th. That's a real impact. If you fill up your tank twice a week or tanks, you're looking at close to $80 to $100 more you're spending on energy alone. We've seen 30-year mortgage rates increase up to nearly 6.5%, according to U.S. government figures. They had fallen last year. Obviously impacts the building, the manufacturing, and the buying of homes. We're all well aware of the growth in Utah and the potential impact it can have on that. And then market recovery, although markets have recovered a little bit from some of their lows a week ago, in of itself, market recovery is being driven largely on tweets and statements from political leaders and not really at the underlying structure of the international system causing those things. And then lastly, we continue to see the 10-year Treasury rate rise. This makes, as you all know as business owners, it just makes borrowing more expensive. Right now, I think it sits at 4.31%. In December, it was under 4. So with that, I'll pause there if there's any immediate questions about anything I've said or any other topics of interest within the next few minutes.
Eric, maybe I'll take a point of privilege while we wait for folks to think of their questions. A lot of what we do in the webinar and in our conversations with companies, you know this, and your interactions is everybody wants a crystal ball. What's this look like in the future? Yeah, we get the snapshot now. So it's a two-part question. What's the future look like from your point of view? And then going on offense is another thing in terms of like what is if I'm a Utah company, and we've talked a little bit about this, so I know I'm asking a question that you already know the answer to. But generally, if I'm a Utah company, what are the direct impacts or what should I be thinking about broadly with some of the information that you've laid out? What are you experiencing in your conversations with businesses? What's that look like? And what would you advise folks attending the webinar thinking about tariffs and other disruptions to their trade?
Yeah, simple question.
Yeah, right. Two-part complex question.
Yeah.
Just a softball right there for our audience.
So broadly, the war with Iran is kind of a continuation of trends we've seen over the last couple of years. And so, uh, from a business perspective, I think one of the most important things in any organization is predictability. And I think that predictability is really kind of being damaged in a lot of people's eyes right now. So we talked trade, and the World Trade Center Organization the other day announced that now only about 72% of world trade is being done through most favored nation status. That's down from about 80% a year ago, which is a pretty remarkable drop in just a year. Um, that very order that kind of governs it from uh, dispute resolution to appointing of appellate judges and everything else, those are not happening right now. And so we're kind of what the war with Iran is seen as this weaponization of trade, right, and trade routes. Because you can't take to the World Trade Center Organization a dispute when you don't control, when you have no access, whether it's the Strait of Malacca, Taiwan Straits, or in this case, Strait of Hormuz. And so, how do you have that rules-based order and impact to have just um, resolve disputes aside from returning to hostilities? And for 80 years, we've had these organizations that existed. So it's the impact to those. Um, there's an impact to the stability of NATO, right? Right now, I mean, I think NATO will endure. How NATO endures, part of me wants to view it as siblings can fight and have disputes. I'm not being pejorative when I say that, and they can agree to disagree on things. This one seems a little different right now with the refusal of Poland to have Patriots redeploy out of there, France overflight routes for weapons to resupply Israel, Spain and Italy not allowing assets to embark from their countries or refuel. Those certainly fuel the fire on some people's view of NATO's relevance. And again, this is part of that international order. So if I had to look out in a crystal ball and being somewhat informed by some things, I whenever hostilities end, I think right now projections are still 4 to 6 months for things to stabilize. But I think what we're going to continue to see is the very nature of what kind of global trades against, which is a continuation of onshoring and regionalization of um, manufacturing or looking in. So, what impact does that have on Utah businesses if Asia it wants to be insular and just rely on landlines of communication to resupply, right? That might benefit China. What does that mean to the European Union if they're looking more internally and looking less on the U.S. from security or from trade? I'll pause there.
Yeah, great. So what I'm hearing is think through your supply chains, maybe diversify, don't act too quickly, but think through the broader situation and what your options could be to adjust.
Yeah, because it truly impacts. I mean, even helium, right? And it's like, well, what's the big deal with helium? Well, because of helium's chemical properties of being fairly well inert and having wonderful heat conduction properties, right? It's critical in the making of chips. Right now, 1/3 of the world's helium production is stuck inside the Middle East and it can't get out. And anything, so nothing's being produced. And the roughly couple thousand containers that were ready to ship and that had been liquefied. They're sitting in ports right now or in storage yards and can't get out, and they generally have a shelf life of about 45 days. So, what is the impact a couple years down the road on chip production from anything from computers to phones to satellites? And chip makers are already kind of starting to say they might not make their 2030 forecast because of this disruption.
Yeah. Thanks, Eric. We do have a question in the Q&A. The U.S. has been reinvesting and reshoring many critical industries in recent years, but are we moving fast enough to insulate against a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan? What can Utah and other states do to minimize disruption and be prepared for worst case scenarios?
Well, as Ben kind of said, it's the continue onshoring. I personally think if China invaded Taiwan, it would be such a global disruption, depending on the US's response and the world's response, that it would be such a disruption. Um, Not being fatalistic about, hey, I don't know if we can do anything, but that is certainly a um, an outcome that using all instruments of national power, especially the diplomatic one, um, to avoid, because that will be so disruptive. Um, I forgot the exact amount of world trade that moves through kind of the Straits of Taiwan and the Malacca Straits. And that's if you could even keep something regionalized in that area. So if I was a business looking out, it would be continue to tie in those. I don't want to say stockpiling, that's the wrong word. But diversifying supply chains on where things are coming from.
Great, thanks. Um, are there any other questions from anyone right now?
I may chime in and just this is following the theme and almost it's a different way of asking the same question. But Eric, I'm wondering what maybe an example without calling out a specific company. What are some examples or an example of a company that you've seen handle some of this general chaos really well, right? Whether it's the Middle East or just the drastic shifts in federal policy, like, and what sort of things have you taken away that could benefit, some of our Utah companies that are here?
Yeah, it's less specific on a company, more what we've seen from countries in response to things. So when we take the energy crises of the 70s, right? The first kind of the 1972, 73 OPEC, we saw France move away from, we'll call it petroleum, and really focus on building up their nuclear industry, right? So we saw a country completely shift from, hey, a hydrocarbon base to a nuclear base. We saw the Danes move to wind power
Mhm.
for a lot of their energy. So you're seeing this whole scale movement away from being dependent on one area or one particular product. The US is actually pretty far ahead of this over the last few years, probably predating fracking, but certainly going from the 70s and helping with fracking to become more or less a net exporter of energy. That doesn't mean we get all of our energy internally, but so that diversification from a national security perspective of the country and how does the country change behavior? And we've seen that with moving. Part of the interconnectedness of the world, though, right now, again, just using helium, although the US is the largest producer of helium in the world, Russia's right up there too, but their helium's banned. And then Qatar, I think, was number two or number three. And we one third of it's locked up. So that continued diversification and truly what are alternatives to one-off things? So again, sticking with helium, there is no viable alternative right this second for a property that is readily available that can cool and not react like helium. So from a company perspective, that diversification of not just the supply chain, but are there other products that can accomplish the same task that a given component is needed for?
That's great. And it's also potentially hidden in that is maybe even an opportunity for businesses looking for opportunities abroad. If a country is pivoting their portfolio and it's something that could be beneficial to your business, it's something to monitor and keep an eye out for. So
Absolutely.
Great. Well, we are about at time. Thank you so much, Eric. There's a note in the chat letting everyone know sometime in the next few weeks, we'll do a more in-depth roundtable with Eric, really diving deeper into what's going on in the Middle East, impacts Utah businesses and things like that. If that's something that is of interest of you, please feel free to reach out to us so that we can make sure that you get the invitation to that. Otherwise, hope everyone has a great weekend. I know a lot of folks are on spring break next week, but we will still be here on Friday with another iteration of our webinar. So look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great day.
thanks, everyone.